Amen.
Amen.
Okay.
All right. Well, let me pull up our notes here and let's get started. All right. Ms. Garzon, good morning. Good to see you. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
You're a very young man, only 50 years old, right?
Yes.
That's the big one. All of us still have another 10 years or so before we get there. So, right, Pastor Bobby? You're muted. Your microphone's not working.
Still young, still young.
Still young. He doesn't know how to use the electronics yet.
I muted myself. Okay. I will not create noise. Pastor Tim, I'm still 20 years away.
Exactly. Oh, you're 20 years away. Okay. Okay. Anyway, I hope you had a blessed time with your birthday. It was yesterday. When was your birthday?
Pastor,
Yeah, when was your birthday? Yesterday?
last Sunday, Pastor, August 20.
Oh, okay. So I'm a little late. Sorry about that. I don't look at Facebook very often, so.
Happy birthday, Brad.
Yeah, I wish you blessings, Brad.
Thank you, Pastor.
All right. For your birthday, especially, we're going to have a special instruction on diagramming just for your birthday. I know it's the present you wanted more than anything was to talk about diagramming. So this is dedicated. This session is dedicated to you. All right. Speaking of diagramming, let's continue our way towards the text in John. We spent a lot of time on the grammar, looking at the sentences, how those break down, focusing on phrases and clauses and subject, verb, object, and predicate, adjective, and all of those things. And so what I want to do is now take us back to applying all of that to our structural diagram. And again, remember the diagram, and I went through several examples with you in Ephesians on different passages, but the diagram is sort of the visual representation of how the phrases and clauses connect to each other. And so the procedure is, for doing the diagram, we spent a lot of time on this first step, but the first part is to identify the independent clause. Again, we call it the main subject, verb, and object of the sentence. All right? And like I said, we've been spending a lot of time doing that. Usually you'll find this clause near the beginning of the paragraph. And again, remember, an independent clause is a subject and verb, a series of words that have a subject and a verb and can stand alone as a complete thought. All right? There are dependent clauses, which is a series of words that have a subject and a verb but cannot stand alone. And then there are phrases. Those are just a series of words that do not have both a subject and an object. Okay, so if we can remember those, the independent clause, the dependent clause, and then phrases. All right. Now the independent clause, that's the main idea in the sentence, and then the dependent clause will modify a word in another clause or phrase, and that is the same with the phrase. Modifies a word, okay, elsewhere in the sentence. It could be part of modifying something in the main clause or independent clause or something else. All right, so we'll see. We've seen that. We'll look at several examples from our passage today. So the first step is identify the independent clause. All right, the thing we've been doing the last few weeks. Find that main subject and verb in the sentence. And then the second thing we want to do is then after that, identify the rest of the phrases and clauses by finding the connector words. All right, and I think if I remember right, we started talking about that last week. But find the connector words. There are connector words which connect a dependent clause or a phrase. All right, there's essentially 4 types of connector words that we have. All right, and we'll cover those in a minute. All right, so that's the second step. First, identify the independent clause. Second, then break down the rest of the sentence or paragraph into the phrases and clauses by finding the connector words. And then third, indicate what each phrase or clause modifies and how it modifies. Okay? And then lastly,
Dependent clause means
indent the phrase or clause under the word it modifies. All right, so these are the 4 steps. Let me get them closer so you can see them all. All right, identify the independent clause. Then the next step is to identify the rest of the phrases and clauses by locating the connector words, and then take those phrases or clauses and find out what word is it modifying and how is it modifying, and then finally draw out the diagram putting that phrase or clause under the word it modifies. Okay, so let's do that. That's sort of the overview, those 4 steps. Now let's look at these in detail. All right. So again, the first step, as I said, we spent a lot of time on this. If you remember, a sentence is made up of an independent clause. It has to have one because there needs to be a complete thought or a main idea presented, plus additional phrase or phrases, plus possibly additional dependent clause or clauses. Okay? That's a sentence. Now, our goal is once we identify this independent clause, the main subject, verb, and sometimes object, is to now look for and identify the connector words, because those connector words will introduce a dependent phrase, or a dependent clause or a phrase. So we have one of the main types of connector words are conjunctions. And I think in previous notes, and I'll have it on the notes this week, you can go to the Wikipedia, this Wikipedia address, and it'll give you a whole list of the different kinds of conjunctions, all right? You can remember the common ones: and, but, or, for, because, since, therefore, right? So that, in order that, for this reason. Okay, these are all conjunctions. They connect phrases or clauses together, all right? And probably among the most common are and but, all right? Now, there's a second kind of connector word. So as you're going through and breaking down the sentence, you're going to look for conjunctions, because those are going to now tell you what comes after the conjunction is another phrase or clause. A second kind of connector word are prepositions, and let me highlight these just to make it easier to, all right? Now, prepositions, they're defined as words. Oh, I forgot to, I put here, I'll just highlight the whole thing. I put here a brief definition. A conjunction is defined as a word that joins clauses, phrases, or words together. That's all it is. It's a word or a phrase that joins clauses, phrases, or words together. A preposition, on the other hand, is a word which links a noun to another word. Remember, a noun is simply define a person, place, or thing. All right? And a preposition is simply a word that links that noun to another word. And it tells us something about how those two, that noun and the other word, are connected together. So, for example, if my preposition is with, then I know this noun is with the thing it's being linked to. If it's by, then I know this noun is by the word it's being linked to. I live by the forest. Okay, so I've just linked the forest to where I live. That's a location. All right, or he hits the ball with the bat. All right, I've just linked this noun bat with how he hits the ball. All right, so prepositions just simply link a noun to another word, and there's a bunch of prepositions. I don't even know how many prepositions there are in the English language, but there are several. All right, and so you can find the list again on Wikipedia, their list of English prepositions. Okay, but just think of them as that they're a connector word, and they're connecting a noun to another word. All right, a conjunction is a word, or sometimes there's more than one word, but usually a word that joins a clause or phrase. So it joins an entire clause or phrase to another clause or phrase. Preposition links a noun to another word. Now there's a third type of connector word, and it's called the relative pronoun. All right, relative pronoun. And remember, a pronoun, sorry, we're getting into some of the grammar here, but we have to do it. A pronoun is something that represents a particular noun. Usually we think of it as he, she, they, we, something like that. There are what's called relative pronouns because they are types of pronouns that specifically introduce a dependent clause. Okay? There's only a few of them. Who, whom, which, that. Okay? So if you see one of these words, actually, if you see any of these words, then it's going to introduce a dependent clause. Okay, and we saw some of these before. The man who was tall hit his head on the door. All right, the connector word who, and it introduces a dependent clause, was tall. Because notice I have my subject who, my verb was, and then the predicate adjective. The who is introducing, now this clause does not stand by itself, therefore it's dependent. So who introduces this dependent clause? All right, and notice here, this dependent clause actually cuts the main sentence. The main subject verb object is this. The man hit his head, right? That's the main subject and verb in this. That's the independent clause here in this particular sentence. But notice, who was tall is breaks in between the subject and the verb. And we're going to see that when we diagram in John today. So how we would diagram it is this. The man who hit his head the man who was tall hit his head on the door. All right, so if I look at this sentence, the independent clause is the man hit his head being the object. But notice I have this dependent clause modifying man in between. So this is how I diagram it. I insert a line to connect back up the subject and the verb. And then on the door tells me where he hit his head. All right. Now notice we have that other kind of connector, preposition here. So this is connecting this noun to the verb because it's telling us where he hit his head. This relative pronoun is connecting this dependent clause to the man. What man? The man who was tall, that man. All right? So it's specifying which man. All right? So that's what this looks like. And this dependent clause split my subject from my verb. So that's why I put this line here to show those are connected together. All right. So far we have this. We have 3 kinds of connector words we've looked at: conjunctions, prepositions, and relative pronouns. All right. There's a 4th type, participles. All right. Participles are those verbal nouns that they often modify a verb, and they have the ing, sometimes the ed ending. All right, we saw those in several verses earlier. I think we talked about the Great Commission, right? Make disciples of all the nations. And then Jesus said, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, of the Holy Spirit. So we have this participle here, baptizing. All right, that's a connector word. It doesn't stand alone. It is a verb, but it modifies another verb. And in this case, it modifies make disciples. All right? So look for those as well. Now, not every word that ends in ing is going to be a participle. You'll have to be careful with that. But as we've talked about in the past, the interlinear is really our guide with this, and we'll pull that in to show you some examples. All right? So those are the 4 kinds of connector words that you'll see. They're the most common: conjunctions, prepositions, relative pronouns, participles. Okay? You guys with me so far? Any questions at this point? Again, I'll put in your in the handout, you can find those lists of the conjunctions and prepositions, and I'd encourage you to cut and paste those, put them somewhere so you have them with you when you're going through a passage, and you can look and consult those lists. Sometimes, actually often you will see participles as well, especially in Paul's writings. And I'll show you how you can confirm that they are participles. Lastly, and this is this isn't a connector word really, but it's connector symbol, and that is punctuation. All right? And again, we understand punctuation to be those marks or symbols which separate phrases and clauses. All right? So we know of the period, the comma, the colon, semicolon, what is there? Question mark, right? There's several kinds of symbols, punctuation symbols, that are used in the English language. And those can be helpful as well. But remember, there's one caution about these. What is the caution, men, when we use punctuation to identify the phrases or clauses? Anyone remember? What do we have to remind ourselves or remember about punctuation? Is punctuation in the original Greek and Hebrew?
There's none.
Correct.
None of the original.
What does that mean then? How did the punctuation get there? Who put it there?
It was added by the translators.
Exactly. So this is added by the translators. All right.
It's the Englishman who added it.
It's the what?
It's the Englishman who added it.
Englishman. So it's added by the translator. So it's their interpretation. So just keep that in mind. They are helpful, but they're not always perfectly accurate. All right. And so just be aware of that. But punctuation can be a helpful guide for us as well. Okay. Now sometimes you will not see a connector word or punctuation to help you, but 95% of the time you will see one of these 5 things. You will see a conjunction or a preposition or a relative pronoun or a participle, and then, like I said, punctuation. 95% or even higher, you will have one of these that will guide you. Now, in poetry, it's not as common. Poetry often takes out the conjunctions and even sometimes prepositions. Because it's poetic language, it tries to shorten the phrases or clauses just for poetic effect, for artistic quality. That's the nature of Hebrew poetry. It's short, pithy, terse. So to do that, sometimes conjunctions or prepositions will be left out. Sometimes even a part of a phrase will be left out. So when we get to poetry in Module 3, I'll show you that. I'm just giving you a heads up now. But in most epistles, in the epistles, this will be common to find one of these connector words, as well as narrative. So this will be a helpful guide for us. So again, what do we look for these connector words for? Because they will show us where to break off each phrase or clause. These connector words will show us where to break off the phrase or clause. All right? All right, we'll do an example in a minute. Now, indicate what each phrase or clause modifies and how. That's the third step. Okay? We've broken up the phrases and clauses. So for example, if we were to do this on the man who was tall blocked my shot and threw the ball out of bounds as the clock ran out. Okay? Let's just practice for a minute on this one. Brio, we'll start with you, brother. Pastor Anselmo, tell me why don't you tell me what connector words do you see in this sentence here? Just tell me the connector words you see.
Connector words, sir.
Yeah. So one of these 5.
First, who.
Okay, good. Who? And what is that?
Relative pronoun.
Relative pronoun. Good. What's the next connector word that you see, Brio?
And
The other one is and.
Good. What kind of connector word is that?
Conjunction.
It is a conjunction.
Very good. All right. Where's the next one?
Out of.
oh,
Yeah.
Out
See that?
of.
Yeah, out of, or those
Yes,
are
sir.
both. Okay, and then is there another one?
It seems that,
us.
Yes, as.
yes, as.
Okay. All right. So these are the connector words, and that means I can break up. This is how I do it. I just take it on my Microsoft Word document, and I do that. All right. So now I've broken up the phrases by identifying their connector words, phrases and clauses. All right. Now, the next step is I need to determine, okay, what do these phrases or clauses modify? All right. Each one of these modifies something else in the sentence. All right. Or connects to something else in the sentence. I need to figure that out. That's the third step. Indicate what phrase, and I'll just copy and paste this down here. What phrase or clause, what each phrase or clause modifies and how. So we've already done part of this earlier, but I'll ask Sir Sid, since you're the next guy up, tell me what this phrase or first tell me this, if I have a phrase or clause here, and then what it modifies.
A dependent clause modifies man who was tall.
Okay, good. And what do I do with, is this whole thing a dependent clause?
No.
No, it's not.
Block my shot is the verb phrase.
Yes. So now I have to, that's why I told you guys, find the independent clause, because I should have done this. Right? Because here's my subject. I'll just do this. This is the subject of the independent clause. And then here is the verb and object of the independent clause. You guys see that? So that's why I have it on a separate line. There's no connector word here at the beginning because it's part of the independent clause. It's part of the main sentence. So I wouldn't have, who or at or when or anything like that, because it's the independent clause. So this is the subject, the man. I'll put it in another color. And this is the verb and the object of my independent clause. So that's why I told you, first step is find that independent clause. Otherwise, it'll be confusing. You'll be going, what? Wait, where's my connector word here? I don't see one. Well, it's not supposed to be there because the word, the subject and the verb and the object are all part of the clause. But we have this dependent clause, as Sid noted, sandwiched in between it. All right? Now, so in this step, I'm going to first identify what this phrase modifies and how. So, Sir Sid, can you tell me what it modifies and how does it modify it?
Who was told modified man.
It modifies man. Okay, good. What kind of man? What it's telling us something about the man, the subject.
The state of being of the man.
Exactly, and in this case, good. Sir Sid mentioned this is a verb is a state of being. In this case, it's not describing an action, but it's describing something about him, a state. Let me reduce this a little bit. Okay. All right, Pastor Bobby, tell me about this next statement here. What is it, and what's it modifying, and how?
The next statement. And
Yeah.
through the ball, Pastor
Yes.
Tim.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. There's a conjunction there, and it is also because of the conjunction, Pastor Tim. No, that is and through the ball modifies the man.
The man through the building.
Okay, so is it
Through the ball.
modifying or doing something else?
Or it could be an
Go ahead.
yeah. It modifies the okay.
Just started to say it. You were
Uh-huh.
on the right track there a minute ago.
Yeah.
Is this modifying some? What kind of is this a phrase or a clause? That's where you can come back to. First answer, is this a phrase or a clause? And through the ball.
It's a clause.
The clause.
It's a
Because
clause.
it has, yes.
Because
What
there is a
kind?
verb.
It's
The
a
man through the
dependent
ball.
clause.
Independent or dependent? I didn't hear you.
It is a independent clause.
Okay. And how do you know that? That is correct.
It has a subject and an object, and because of the conjunction.
Yes. The conjunction is key here. And through the ball. That's telling me the man did two things, right?
Yeah.
He blocked my shot and then the subject is implied there, right? He threw the ball.
Okay.
Okay, so it's an independent clause. So actually there's two independent clauses here. There's two parallel statements being made. Okay? So this will be, and then my subject is still he, or the man, excuse me. And then the verb is through. And then my object is the ball. All right, so the man is doing two things here of equal importance. All right, because he using the kind of verb he's using here. He blocked and he threw. Okay?
You have a preposition next.
Yes, let me do this first. Okay. All right, so yeah, out of bounds.
Yeah.
What is that modifying and how? Is this a phrase or a clause?
The prepositional phrase modifying through the verb.
It modifies through. And what is it telling us about the verb? The action. How is it modifying?
Okay. It is describing how
Location, where?
the where.
Yes, where? Oops.
Okay, where.
Yeah, where he threw the ball. Okay?
Out.
He threw it out of bounds. And then finally, Pastor Allen, why don't you answer this one? This last statement, tell me if it's a phrase or a clause, and then tell me what it's modifying and how.
The clock ran out is another clause.
Is it dependent or independent?
Independent.
Okay. And how do you know it's not dependent? Or what would tell us it's dependent? I should ask it that way.
Because it's a complete sentence.
Okay, but is it a complete thought? Can it stand alone?
No. Considering the whole context of it, it looks like dependent.
You've got one big clue that it's dependent.
As. The word
Yes.
as.
Yes. There's a word introducing this clause. So that's
Yes.
telling you it's dependent. All right.
Yes. But what I mean is just looking at that clause, it looks like, if you separate it, it looks like independent. But considering the whole context, especially that word as, gives the clue that it is dependent.
Exactly.
It is dependent.
Now, if it had been worded this way, now it's independent.
Correct.
Because of the word and. And would be telling me this is a third statement. All right? But I didn't use the word and, I used the word as.
Okay, so it's independent.
No, you were if I had used the word
It's
and,
dependent. It's dependent.
yes. Sorry,
What I
I'm
mean
not
is
trying to
it's
confuse you.
dependent. I get confused.
But so this is why it's important to see what kind of connector word we have here. If it's an and, then that means it's a parallel idea. If it's an as, that's telling me that this clause is dependent because it's connected to something above. It's modifying something above. It can't stand alone in this sentence. If I had just written the clock ran out, then that is a complete thought that stands alone. But in this sentence, I have that word as in front of it. That's telling me it can't stand alone in this sentence. It's dependent on, it's linked to something else. Okay? So, it is a dependent clause because of that word as.
Modifying the
And it, yeah,
verb.
telling me what it's modifying. Pastor Allen.
Out of bounds. Wait. Threw the ball out of bounds. I mean, I think threw the ball.
Okay. How is it modifying through? How is it
Uh,
modifying the action?
when.
Yes. Excellent.
Describing when.
Exactly. It's telling us when he threw the ball. All right. So here, let me remind you of when you're trying to figure out how a phrase modifies a particular word, or you're trying to just figure out what word it's modifying. Remember, there's two kinds of modifiers, two ways that a phrase or a clause will modify a particular word. All right. And it's by considering what question does the phrase or clause answer. So for example, up here, when we looked at out of bounds, we asked, okay, what does it modify? We said through. Well, how do we know? Because it's where he threw the ball. So it's answering the question where. In this case, as the clock ran out, answers the question when. And so whenever you have a phrase or clause answering the question where, when, why, or how, then it will modify the phrase or clause will be modifying a verb. All right? Because it's these kinds of questions are related to an action. Whenever you're talking about where, it's where something happened. Whenever you're talking about when, it's when an action took place. Why, how, and then there's a few others, but these are the four simple questions to consider. There's a few others like the condition, if something. There's also the purpose. There's a few other ways, but the big ones are when, where, why, and how. Okay? If your phrase or clause can answer one of those questions, and so as the clock ran out, that's a time statement. So that's telling us when. Out of bounds, that's a location, as somebody said. So that's telling us where. All right? And if it said he threw the ball or he blocked my shot, and now let's say that I added here, instead of who was tall, I said because he was tall. Let's say I changed my sentence. If I had the man blocked my shot because he was tall, this would be answering what question?
Adjective ball.
Why? Why?
Yeah, why or even how, but because of the word because tells us why he blocked.
It implies reason.
Yeah, it implies the reason. Okay? So it's going to modify blocked. Again, it will modify an action. Okay? So that's what you can ask yourself when you break down all the phrases and clauses, and then the next step is, okay, now I have to figure out what is this modifying and how. If I see that my clause answers the question where, when, why, or how, I know it's going to modify an action. But if my phrase or clause modifies, answers a question, what kind, which one, how many, who, then those,
What color?
what's that?
What color?
Yeah, or things like color. If it's a description, these will, the phrase or clause will be modifying a noun. All right? So that's why in the original, when we had the man who was, the man who was tall, this was modifying the man because it's telling us something about the man. What kind of man? It's description. Okay? So it's not modifying an action. All right? Who was tall, it's modifying a description. Now, if the word was because he was tall, that's modifying an action because it's describing why he blocked the shot. Okay? So these connector words are actually very, very important because if you can understand what they are doing. If I have a conjunction and, that's connecting two parallel ideas, or if I had said or but. But then there are other words which tell me something different, as we've been talking about. And that's why we're going through many examples, because you need to see how these things work. But one kind of clue that can help you when you're trying to figure out this third step is to ask yourself, okay, I've got this phrase out of bounds. All right, let me just think about this a minute. what is this phrase telling? It's telling me a location, right? Out of bounds is a place, a location. Therefore, it's answering a question where. Ah, it must be modifying an action then, because where means the phrase or clause will modify a verb. All right. Okay. So we have 3 steps at this point in the process of diagramming. Identify the independent clause, identify the rest of the phrases and clauses, and to do that we have to find the connector words. And then, and this is the hardest part of the whole 4 steps, is now figure out what does this phrase or clause modify and how. And you do that by determining, figuring out, answering one of those questions. Is this answering the question where, when, how, what kind, who, which one? All right. And then lastly, the last step is just now, once you figure out which word it modifies, now we want to show that visually by putting the phrase or clause under that particular word. All right. So if I do it for my sentence that I made up here. Whoops. Oh. This is where I meant to kind of do, I'll come back to that. Let me just do that right now. All right, I've been using these words quite a bit. I just want to make sure that you have a clear understanding. So this will be, again, a quick grammar review. This is, okay, this is nosebleed time. Just warning you, okay? So be ready. Have your Kleenex ready. Wipe your nose. Yeah.
Okay.
You got a towel.
Nosebleed time. Nosebleed time is dependent phrase.
It is introduced by a conjunction.
Introduced by a conjunction. All right. So, as I mentioned, noun. Okay, it's a word used to identify a person, place, or thing, right? Noun can be, as we said, man, pastor, right? Woman, dog, block.
A naming word.
Street. It's a naming word. Yeah, that's even better definition. A naming word. And then a proper noun can be actually a person's name, right? And then we have the pronouns, which are here, and those are essentially a word that represents or refers to a noun.
Takes the place of a noun.
Yeah, it takes the place of a particular noun. All right. So, for example, he, she, it, they, we, I, etc. All right. Now, as I mentioned to you, a relative pronoun is a special case. All right, of pronouns, and there's only a few of them: who, which, and that. And the relative pronoun, again, is the key. Is it introduces a dependent clause. Okay? It introduces a dependent clause. All right. And then we have our favorite, the verb. Okay? The verb.
Action word.
It describes an action or, don't forget this, a state.
State of being.
All right? We talked about that. There's 2 kinds of verbs, 2 categories. The kind that describe an action, and then the kind that describe a state or condition. Okay?
State or condition.
And we can put that, state or condition. All right? So that's, and then an adverb, you can think of it as it adds on to a verb, is the idea. It modifies a verb.
Verbs.
Okay? Or it can modify an adjective, which we'll talk about in a minute, or another adverb. Okay? So in other words, an adverb tells when, where, why, how, to what degree. All right? And then finally we have what's called an adjective, and that simply is a word that modifies a noun.
Noun.
Okay? It describes an attribute or characteristic of the noun. That is, what kind, how many, what color, which one, etc. It's a describer of the noun. All right, so you have, and again, these will be in your handout, so you have them there, but we've been using these words quite a bit, so I just want to make sure we kind of cover these definitions again with you. All right? So that's why when I talked to you here earlier about when we're identifying what each phrase and clause modifies, I said there's the adverbial. That's just a clause that modifies a verb. All right? And then there's the adjectival. It sounds fancy, but it's just a clause that modifies a noun. All right? Okay. Nosebleed time over. Partly. All right? So now let's go back to this is our little sentence that we've been using. The fourth step is now that since we've identified the phrases and the clauses, and actually I should take this one, because this one, notice I put my descriptions in parentheses here for each phrase. So I'm going to do that here. All right, so I have the man, and that's the subject, who was tall. Now, it's modifying the man, so I put it under man. It's telling me something about the man, right? It's describing him. What kind of man? A tall man. All right, and then again, blocked my shot. This is not a new phrase or clause. It's the continuation of, it's the verb for the subject that we had earlier. So I'm just going to draw a line because I want to keep my word order. So I'm going to just draw a line here to show the finishing or the continuation of that main subject and verb. So this is the verb and the object. Okay? Of my main sentence. All right. Let's see. Let's take this one out. Now here's my and. What I do with this is, with conjunctions, I just separate it out because now I have two main ideas here. He blocked my shot and he threw the ball. Second independent clause. Out of bounds. Now, here's something that we'll have to deal with exegetically. First, I put in brackets here. I just say where he threw. Okay, that answers that question of where. And then this will also go under the verb because it's describing when he threw. Now, and I underline my verbs. Now here's a question. Do these two phrases here, or phrase and clause, do they modify through, do they modify blocked, or do they modify both? You'll have this question often when you're doing your diagramming of Scripture. When you have this and, so now it's telling me I have these two parallel actions. Blocked my shot and threw the ball. And then I've got these modifying phrases, phrase and clause. How do I know what it's modifying? How do I know it's not he blocked my shot out of bounds? Do you understand my question?
The principle of nearest context, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, that's part of what you're going to have to determine is, okay, what makes sense? Now, Now the nearest antecedent, the nearest word that it's connected to is through. So we know that it's modifying that action at least. The question is it modifying both actions? Okay?
Yeah.
And that's where you're going to have to use the context and the rules of interpretation. Out of bounds, does that make sense? Can he block my shot out of bounds and then throw the ball out of bounds?
No.
No.
No, it's the consequence. It's the consequence of the block.
Yes. So you have to think about what makes sense here. He could block my shot out of bounds, but because I have this second statement, I know that he did not block my shot out of bounds and then throw it out of bounds. Because I understand the game of basketball.
Yes. The second independent clause is a different action. It is distinct from the first action.
Yes.
That's the sense. It's the sense.
Okay. Now I bring this up
Block-
for this
Block
reason.
and throw are day and night.
That's a
Yes.
continuous action. Succession of action.
And here's where, let's see. You know, we talked early on about background context. Okay? Who can tell me the background context of a passage? What is that?
A basketball game.
Yeah, in this case. In general, the background context of something is the place, the situation, the speaker.
Geographical, historical.
Yes, all of that.
Kayo nga,
So-
kusok itong internet kung dili necessary ang video,
So
pero
here-
i-stop niyo mo ang video. Press ako.
Let me,
Kain yung one, webinar.
Anselmo is
There.
giving instruction also.
okay. Yeah.
Out of bounds.
Out of bounds. So this sentence shows us something important about knowing the background context. What if I didn't know the sport of basketball? Right? If I had no idea what this was talking about.
Sounds more like a baseball.
Or yeah, but you don't block a baseball shot. It's a basketball reference, or it could be hockey, but he threw the ball, so I know there's a ball, I know there's a bounds, and this idea, this wording of block the shot, that's used in basketball. So,
Yeah.
so
It's a
because
basketball game.
I know that tells me something that's not written here, because I know the rules of basketball, right? Well, some
Yeah.
of the rules. Right? We understand there's boundaries. And we
Yeah.
understand one of the rules, once the ball is knocked out of bounds, it's a dead ball.
It's a violation
So
Outside of the court,
outside of the court.
yeah. So
Yeah.
by knowing,
because there's boundary line.
yeah, and we know the rules,
Right.
don't we? Like once the ball's out of bounds, then
It's outside.
it's outside, the ball's dead, someone has to pass it in bounds. So that's why I know out of bounds cannot go to the blocked shot because he threw the ball. If he had blocked the ball out of bounds, he couldn't pick it up then and throw it at that point because it's a dead ball.
Mutually exclusive event.
Yeah, and the only way I know this is if I know the background context. If I don't, if I'm not familiar with the sport at all, then I might say, okay, well, it's possible it could go to both. Right? Like, for example, if you had a sentence, what would be an example? Rejoice in the Lord
Always.
and obey his commands, for this glorifies God. All right? Here I have two statements, right? Two distinct commands in this case. Rejoice in the Lord. And that actually would be
Subject implied.
Yeah, you. And you again. Obey his commands. Now I have this phrase. Now what does this phrase answer? What kind of question? That word for tells me.
How?
Is this
Uh,
how, or the word for often gives a reason.
Why?
Why? So
Ito
I
why?
know
word is
this is going to modify a verb. All right, the two verbs I have here are rejoice
And obey.
and obey. Now, the nearest
Na may
verb
ilag-
is obey.
obey.
Obey its commands, for this glorifies God. Correct? Okay, we know it modifies obey. The question we would then ask is, does it modify both? He gave two commands. Does this phrase, for this glorifies God, go with just obey his commands, or can it also go with rejoice?
It goes both.
Both.
We would say
Both, sir.
both.
Both.
All right, it makes sense
Yes,
theologically,
both.
because you wouldn't have, someone wouldn't say, rejoice in the Lord, for this glorifies God,
And obey his command.
and obey his commands, for this glorifies God. He wouldn't repeat that. That's what we call redundant or repetitive, unless he's wanting to emphasize something. But normally it would be like this. And yes, it's modifying both. And so what if we went back to my sentence here and we say, well, out of bounds, it modifies both verbs. It can grammatically, but is that what the author intended here? And again, the background context for this sentence, because I know the background, I know the answer. If I didn't know the background, if I didn't know the rules of basketball, I might say it goes to both. Which someone who knows basketball would say, no, that violates the rules. That can't happen. So this tells us, brothers, context is king, and even the background context is king. What do you know about the culture? What do you know about the situation? What do you know about the author, the recipients? Those all come into importance when you're interpreting.
Come into play.
So it bears upon the whole interpretation.
Yeah.
Pastor Tim, no?
Yeah, so this is why we spent all that time on the
It takes
background
very-
context, because it does help us. All right. Now, there's no basketball passages in the Bible, but it can be the same idea. The better I understand the background of the text, that can help me at times. Or
Pastor
the
Tim,
better
only-
I,
Pastor Tim,
Only wrestling and
basketball-
running.
only
bas-
Only
wrestling and
wrestling
running.
and running.
I'm sorry.
Pastor Bobby.
In basketball, the block can throw the ball out of bounds.
Yes. So that is a possibility.
Mhm.
If I had put he then threw the ball out of bounds, threw the ball,
Mhm.
then that could give me a clue as to whether he's throwing it from the out of bounds or whether he blocked it, grabbed it, and then threw it while
Okay.
he was in bounds. But blocked it, grabbed it, and then when he threw it out of bounds.
That's already rebound. Block and rebound.
Yes. And then a turnover. So again, this is where the context, and when we say that, it's not just the words used, but it's also what do we know about the situation that's here. You know, you mentioned Sid wrestling, and you know, when Paul makes statements about the games and running for the prize, you know, the more we understand about the competition in those days, and even the prize, you know, he talks about the crown,
The laurel.
and it was a wreath, right?
The laurel wreath.
So, I mean, there's lots of background context issues that can really help us in interpreting the better we understand them. All right. So this was just one little simple example to show you how if we understand the background a little bit, in this case, the rules of basketball, we are able to better interpret this passage, if you will, this sentence. Okay. So there's grammar involved, and that's what's helping us determine, you know, where, you know, okay, this out of bounds, that's a location, therefore it's answering the question where, and so it's modifying an action. It's modifying a verb. That's the grammar part. Now, which verb does it modify? That you have to go deeper. It's not just grammar only doesn't answer that question. It guides us to possible answers, but we have to understand more, in this case, the background context, in order to rightly interpret. Or at times you may have to bring in other passages that the author used elsewhere, because it may help guide us a little bit. But ideally, right, the focus is the immediate context, and part of that immediate context includes the background.
Okay.
All right. Any questions on this?
So you just brought to our attention and reminded us, Pastor Tim, that the overall interpretation involves other factors, like the context, the background context of the culture, the history, etc. No, but your point, okay, what I'm getting is, but your point is, we begin with the grammatical diagramming, okay? That's the work at hand.
Correct.
That's the first effort, the grammatical construction.
Yes.
And then, as we are able to handle that, then we bring in the other background factors, okay, the other factors you're now mentioning.
Yes, part of the interpretive process, exactly.
Yes, part of the interpretive process. Bringing in other verses, historical references in scripture, cultural background, and the context of history.
Yeah, and the circumstances, the occasion for the writing, what was going on at the, right, so for example, let me show you an example of this. In Ephesians chapter 3, okay, Paul, he brings up in this chat, I'll start at verse 1, right? For this reason I, Paul, what reason? Well, what has he been talking about previously? What God has done in our salvation in chapters 1 and 2. For this reason I, Paul, prisoner of Christ for the sake of you Gentiles. And then he goes on in this long statement. The next verses 2 through 13 are sort of this parenthetical statement. Because notice, you see the for this reason again in verse 14?
Mm-hmm.
He's actually finishing what he started in verse 1. When he said, for this reason, in verse 1, I, Paul, and then everything after that is modifying Paul. Until we get to verse 14, where he finishes now, for this reason I, and he could have said, Paul, bow my knees before the Father. So verses 2 to 13, he sandwiches this statement about his ministry to the Gentiles, and that he was, by God's grace, given this ministry to the Gentiles to bring the gospel to the Gentiles, so that through the Gentiles in the church that the wisdom of God would be made known and carrying out his purposes. And he does that all for this point in verse 13. Therefore I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf, for they are your glory. You know what triggered that statement? Let's go back to verse 1. I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ. And here's where we need to understand the background of the book of Ephesians. Because he launches from that phrase, the prisoner of Christ, Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles. It's this whole phrase here. And then he launches in the next 12 verses into why he's a prisoner. And he's a prisoner because he bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, do you remember what was it that put Paul in prison when he went to Jerusalem? Okay, he'd gone on his third missionary journey. He comes back to Jerusalem, and he gets thrown in prison. Do you remember what event took place that caused that? It's, I think, in Acts chapter 20. If you don't, that's all right. I'm testing your memory here.
Come again, Pastor Tim, please.
What
I'm sorry.
event caused Paul to be thrown in prison when he was in Jerusalem after his third missionary journey?
He brought some Gentiles with him to Jerusalem.
He brought them. He was accused of not just bringing them to Jerusalem, but
Allowed to enter, sir.
say again.
He allowed to enter in the
Temple worship.
He was
temple worship.
accused of that. He was accused of bringing a Gentile into the location in the temple where only Jews were allowed.
Beyond the court of the Gentiles.
Beyond the court of the Gentiles. Exactly. You guys remember
Yes, sir.
this, right?
Trespassing.
Let me just I'm going to try this out. We'll see if this works. All right. Can you see my whiteboard?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So here,
Yes, sir.
these won't be straight lines. This is the Temple Mount. All right. And here's the Holy of Holies.
Holy of Holies.
Now it's more straight than that. All right. And in front of the Holy of Holies was the court of the priests. Okay. And in front of there was the court of men. Only Jewish men could pass into here. In front of there was the court of women. All right. And then around this was a wall that basically said, if you're a Gentile, you're not allowed past here or we'll kill you. And they actually have found a little signs from ancient Jerusalem. It was a warning. Any Gentile who passes here, it is at the threat of his own life or something like that. So Gentiles were not allowed past here. Now this was the court of the Gentiles out here. Okay? So this is where anybody could go. All right? But no Gentiles could go past this area.
Court.
So Paul was accused of taking a Gentile in here. Now he didn't do that, but that's what they accused him of. All right? And Acts chapter let me see, 20, is it 20, 21, let me see, no, 20, 21, all right, here, yeah, Acts 21, let me get somebody to read this here. Pastor Arn, can you read this passage? Acts 21, 27 through 30. Uh-oh, sorry. All right. Can you read that?
Yes. When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come out our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, that dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut."
Okay. So we see here, right? Paul was, taken into custody, he was thrown into prison. It says later on here, right? Soldiers took him and he ended up getting thrown into prison. And the reason was why? What was he accused of? Verse
Supposed
29.
bringing in
He
Greeks.
brought Greeks into the temple. He brought
Yeah.
Gentiles.
He brought a Gentile, well, he was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. Now, what they meant wasn't just Gentiles could go into the court of Gentiles. They could not go into the court of the Jews. So that's what he's talking about here, is that area of the temple. All right, and then notice who it was that was brought in there. They were accusing him of bringing Trophimus, the
Ephesians.
Ephesians.
one of the Ephesians.
Uh,
All right, and so in the previous chapter, Acts 20, Paul had departed from the elders of Ephesus. They were weeping because Paul said, it's likely you will see my face no more. All right, he goes to Jerusalem. He's accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, and this Gentile was an Ephesian. All right, don't miss that. So he's thrown into jail. He ends up going to Caesarea. He's there for 2 years. Then he's taken to Rome, where he's there for another 2 years. In Rome, he writes an epistle, a letter to the Ephesians. This is like 3 or 4 years later, after he had said goodbye to the elders at Ephesus. And he had told those elders, I won't see your face again. And then Trophimus, one of the brothers in their church, probably, we don't know this for sure, but it would not be a surprise that he'd come back and told the people at Ephesus, Paul got taken into prison because they accused him of bringing me into the temple. And now they're remembering, and Paul said, we won't see him anymore. This is it. He's going to die. He got thrown into prison because he was with us Gentiles, and he's bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. And now look what happened. Now he's going to die. And they're discouraged. They love Paul. Paul spent 3 years of his life in Ephesus. Right? The longest recorded time that Paul was in any of the locations as he was a missionary was in Ephesus. He had built close bonds with many of the people there. All right, so when they find out 3 or 4 years later he's in prison because of one of their own, and they think that's it, we're not going to see him anymore, he's going to die, they're very discouraged. They are losing heart. And so Paul, knowing this background, all right, this is not, we don't have to guess, it's right here in the book of Acts. So going back to Ephesians chapter 3, when Paul mentions, I'm a prisoner of Christ for the sake of you Gentiles, what triggers in his mind? He wants to encourage them that he's not in prison for nothing, that it's not pointless. And so he explains to them the great gift of grace that God gave him to be a minister to the Gentiles, which includes them. And so he's in prison because of that ministry, and that ministry is a good thing. And he wants to encourage them, and that's why he ends this with, don't lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf, for they are your glory. Okay, Paul's saying, I know you're discouraged. I know you're losing heart, but just remember how God is using all of this. And part of it, he's used me to bless you by bringing the gospel to you. So don't be discouraged. See, so this is all part of the background to the letter. And so by understanding that background, this verse makes complete sense why he would put it here. And in fact, this whole verses 2 to 13 make complete sense why he would put it here, because he remembers or realizes they're discouraged. Because again, remember, Tychicus brought word to Paul about the Ephesians. And so he knew they were discouraged. And later, because later in chapter 6, right, remember he says, I've sent Tychicus back to you to encourage you about how I'm doing. All right? So this is just a long example of the importance of background and understanding what is written in a particular passage. and how that will help not only in interpreting a particular verse, but also then even as you're diagramming and how this verse connects to what comes before it and what it means. All right?
Yeah.
And it's
So,
something that,
Pastor Tim,
yes,
yeah. So that's how we begin to really understand the context of verse 12 of Ephesians chapter 3, when he says, in whom we have boldness and confident access through faith in him. So his conclusion, which is also an appeal to not to lose heart, is based on that background. No?
yes,
It's not just the imprisonment per se. No.
yes,
Now we
exactly.
understand that his concern for them losing heart is not just because of his imprisonment, but because of the access, no, that that confident access by faith, no, to God, no, on the context of the division of the Jews and the Gentiles.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And back in chapter 2, that's what he was talking about, the division between Jew and Gentile. And he mentions
Yeah.
there in chapter 2,
Yeah.
verse 14 or 15 or
Uh-huh.
13 about the dividing wall,
13.
Yeah.
right? I think
Yeah.
he's referring,
Dividing wall of hostility.
yeah, I think that by that he's referring to that wall in the temple.
Uh-huh.
That physical wall is a metaphor for the wall of division between Jew and Gentile, because the Jews had taken and added unbiblical laws and which created separation between Jew and Gentile. You know, the original temple design did not have those different courts. It only had two courts, the
Uh-huh.
outer court and the inner court. Remember the tabernacle that God
Yeah.
told Moses to build? It had two
Yeah.
courts. The inner court contained the altar
The
and the
furnitures.
water basin and the Holy of Holies. And the priests were allowed in the inner court. It was also called the court of the priests. And also the person making a sacrifice would be allowed in the inner court. So you'd come if you had your sacrifice, you'd bring your family, you'd come, and then as the head of the family, you would go in to the inner court with the priest. You would slit the throat of the animal, and then the priest would offer it up on the altar on your behalf. And by the way, anyone who, whether Jew or Gentile, was allowed in the inner court if you
Uh-huh.
had made a commitment to follow Yahweh and to submit to the Mosaic covenant. All right? The outer
Yeah.
court was where people would gather, waiting to go into the inner court or waiting for their head of the family to go into the inner court. So the original tabernacle was designed with two courts, and so was Solomon's temple. Two courts, outer and inner. Court of the priests and the outside court. All right? There was no division between a Gentile area and a Jewish area. That was added. It was likely added during the time, the intertestamental period, probably closer to around 175 BC, after the Gentiles had defiled the temple by bringing a pig in. Antiochus Epiphanes brought a pig in and sacrificed it in the temple. And so I think, we don't know for sure, but there's some extra biblical writings that I think that's when the Jews set up these court of the Gentiles and court of the Jews. So that's not in the Bible. There's
That's
just an
their
outer and
tradition.
inner court.
That's from their tradition.
It's tradition brought about by the Jews, and so they created this separation.
Human condition.
Yeah. So the barrier, the dividing wall, wasn't something God did. He
Man-made.
never excluded Gentiles from salvation or worship, did he? Only in the case he did for the, was it the Moabites? At what point? But basically, if you remember that he put the people of Israel, they were to be a light to the nations, to bring them to Yahweh. So God's always been interested in the world, not just the Jews. And so he did not create that barrier wall in the temple. He did not create those different courts to exclude the Gentiles. The Jews did that. And so again, Paul only mentions this in the book, the letter to the Ephesians. And I think he does because of the whole situation with Trophimus. That's what got Paul thrown in jail. They accused him of bringing an Ephesian into that court of the Jews. An unbiblical boundary, by the way.
Violation of social distancing.
Yeah. No, it created, yeah, it was the wrong application of social distancing. So, again, that's another good example in chapter 2 of interpreting that idea of the barrier, the wall, the barrier that the law of commandments contained in ordinances. That he's not speaking about the Mosaic law. He's speaking about the laws added by the Jews.
Man-made laws.
Peter talked about it in Acts 10 when he went to Cornelius's house, and he stepped in the house and he said, "It's against the law for me to even be here." Well, who made that law up? Did God say you can't be with Gentiles? No, Jesus violated that law then, right? Of course, God didn't say that. The Jews added that.
So, Pastor Tim, we're given insight also here of the confidence of Paul. He's very confident that what he's doing is really what God intends to do.
Yes.
And so, on his part, it's like, never mind being in prison. This is the will of God, and this is for your glory.
So, Pastor Tim,
And
Paul
he
is
mentioned also pala, no, he mentioned also in Romans chapter 15. He said this in Romans 15 verse 15.
Uh-huh.
But on some points I have written to you very boldly by way of reminder, because of the grace given me by God to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles, in the priestly service of the gospel to God, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. So it's like, in his mind, the kind of ministry he had is a priestly ministry, and the Gentiles were his offering to God.
Yeah.
In a sense, that's how he viewed his ministry, and that's why he's so bold and confident.
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
Paul was jailed and convicted of non-existing law.
Well, non-existing as far as Scripture is concerned.
Yes.
It was a law as far as the the Jewish leaders
Non-biblical.
was concerned. But yeah, it was a man-made ordinance that created this separation between Jew and Gentile. And so Paul, that's one of the big themes in Ephesians, is this, that the gospel has brought about the unity between Jew and Gentile. And I often wonder, again, this is not in the text explicitly, but I wonder if the Ephesians had a level of anger or animosity toward the Jews for what they did to Paul because of their countrymen. Again, Trophimus, the Ephesian, he would have insight, personal insight into what happened. And I can only imagine, again, this is just me reading between the lines. It's not in Scripture explicitly, but I can only imagine that, Trophimus told of those events. He said, "Yeah, you wouldn't believe what happened. They accused Paul of bringing me into the temple, and then they threw him in prison." And so you could imagine, I wonder, again, if the Ephesians bore a special or particular anger towards the Jews. And so Paul brings up in Ephesians 2, we're one in Christ, because he doesn't do this in Colossians. He doesn't talk about this. He doesn't talk about this dividing wall in any other letter. He does talk about conflict, and we see Jew and Gentile conflict in the book of Acts. Galatians, it comes up. But here in Ephesians, he deals with it explicitly and in an extended passage in chapter 2. I just wonder if he does that because maybe there's some attitudes among the Ephesians towards the Jews because of what's happened.
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
could that be a ground for that one in Revelation, the Ephesians lost their first love, the church of Ephesus?
Who knows? Of course it's possible. You know, it would be a guess. We aren't told explicitly. We know they did lose their first love, but how that happened, you got to remember too, Revelation is about 40 years later. That statement in Revelation. It's this letter to the Ephesians was probably written in the mid to late 50s AD, and the book of Revelation was around 90 AD. So maybe 30, 35 years has passed. So a lot of things could have happened that caused the Ephesians to drift away from their love for Christ, but maybe this was part of that. I don't know. In any case, this is all just a discussion that is reinforce the importance of background context, to reinforce the importance of knowing the occasion of a writing, because that will come into how we understand what the author is saying at different parts in his letter. Okay? All right. Well, in the time we have left, let's get back to John 4. Finally, you remember this book, right? John, the Gospel of John. We were studying this some time ago.
Samaritan woman.
The Samaritan woman. Yeah, it seems like a long time ago. And what started this whole discussion on diagramming was that this is the fifth step in the study of narratives. There will be likely parts in the narrative that you are going to want to diagram, and when it's in the Gospels, it's usually going to be an instructional passage by Christ. And in John 4, we have 3 such passages. John 4, we have, I'll just put this, John 4 instructional passages. Verses 13 and 14, when Jesus talks about the living water. Then we have verses 21 to 24, when Jesus discusses true worship. And then verses, was it 35 to 38? Let me see if I can. 34 to 38, when Jesus commissions the disciples. Okay? So there's 3 instructional sections or statements by Christ within John 4. You're going to want to diagram those, all right? Because those contain propositional truth that it's helpful then to do the diagram for those. It's kind of like a mini sermon that he's offering here. All right? So we have let's just practice on John 4, 13 and 14. Let's go through, and actually I should have put the first step here, which is identify the main independent all right. And we are to Brother Alex. Are you there, Brother Alex? Or are you somewhere else on your spaceship?
Yes, Pastor, I'm here.
Oh, you're invisible. Oh, wow, look at that technology.
Teleport.
Teleported himself. So I'm going to have you read this passage, verses 13 and 14. And then if you could tell me or tell us where the independent clause is. And I'm not going to don't worry about this statement. We're focusing on this part where Jesus speaks, what he says. All right.
Okay. Okay. Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Okay.
All right. This is what he says to the woman at first. What's the independent clause here? And again, what we're looking for is
Everyone who
the main subject, verb, and object, if there is one.
everyone who drinks is the independent clause.
Okay. Let's
Everyone who drinks.
think about that for a minute.
Yes.
We do have a subject here and the verb, but what's this word who doing in there?
It modifies everyone.
Yes. So is this part of the independent clause?
Everyone drinks.
Or is this who drinks a separate clause? Okay, you found the subject, the independent clause, the subject is everyone. What is the verb?
Yes. Drinks.
But we've got this who drinks. So
Okay.
this verb drinks goes with who. It doesn't go with everyone.
Okay. Yes.
So keep looking.
Will thirst.
Everyone, well,
This water will thirst again. Everyone will thirst again.
Does that make sense as being an independent clause? Everyone will thirst.
can I help, sir?
Drinks.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Everyone will thirst again.
And
Yeah, Brio, go ahead. What are you?
sir,
Yeah.
the same, sir. Everyone
Everyone who drinks.
first again.
Yeah, everyone will thirst. Actually, everyone will thirst.
Yes.
That's the main clause.
That's the main clause.
That?
Everyone will thirst.
Yes. Now, what makes it tricky is you've got this other.
Positive, sir.
Yes, sir.
Will thirst.
I inserted a positive.
So here's our. And there's no object actually in this case.
No object. Again is an adverb.
Yeah, again is an adverb, which we'll deal with in a minute. So this is actually the main. Let me do this. I'm going to highlight in a different color. Now it's a little bit of an odd statement. Everyone will thirst again. All right, but that is the main. That's the independent clause. That's the main. Everyone will thirst again. At least so far, that's what we see as the main clause. Now, what he means by that, we're going to need the rest of the phrases to help us interpret that. But this is grammatically the subject, everyone, and will thirst is the verb. All right? Are there any questions on that? Otherwise, you have this. Okay, if you say it's everyone who drinks of this water, and then what do you have? What do you do with will thirst again? How would that fit? This is the full idea. Everyone will thirst. That's the main thought Jesus wants to communicate. And then he'll say, but
it's a conjunction.
yeah, it's a conjunction
Starting,
that will introduce a parallel
starting
contrast to this. And we'll get to that in a
contrast,
minute.
starting independent clause again.
So, yeah, because then there's the next statement is, but whoever, well, let me hold off on that because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So, all right, so we're going to go with everyone will thirst. And if you're not sure, just take a guess and start diagramming. And if the diagram isn't making sense, then maybe go back and see if you did something wrong. But just take a guess and go from there. All right, don't get seized up here. So what we're going to do is now we want to identify the phrases and clauses from the connector words. So I'm going to ask Anselmo to identify for us the first connector word. And again, we're going to skip verse 13. Or sorry, Jesus answered. We're going to start with just what he said. Anselmo, tell me, where's the first connector word you see?
Of.
Okay.
There's a pronoun.
Who?
Thanks.
Where's the next one?
Of. Okay.
Colon. Semicolon.
We have a semicolon. Again,
Yes.
remember that's interpretive, but we'll note it. But notice we have the word but right after it. So that's more direct. The next connector word?
Of.
Again.
Of.
Next,
The next
connector
one?
word, that.
That. Good. Relative
pronoun.
pronoun. That I will give him. Shall never thirst. Where's the next connector word?
But.
But. Conjunction. Next one?
That.
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 Relative pronoun.
In.
In. It's preposition. A
Of.
well of water.
Of.
And
To.
to, sir.
To.
Eternal life. To.
Bringing up to.
To.
Eternal life.
All right. And springing. There's a participle in here. All right.
Springing up, sir, could be an idiom.
Springing up.
Could be
Yeah.
an
And
idiom.
it's actually together. Springing
Idiomatic
up.
expression.
But it's a participle. So we'll just take note of that. And so what we do is simply this. Now I just go through. Now, there's going to be an issue with of is a tricky word. So we're going to find out that's, but this is all that we do for this step. Is we just break up the paragraph at the connector words. Okay? Notice, whoops, sorry. So notice the highlighted, that's the connector words. It's right at the beginning. It introduces the phrase or clause. Okay? Any questions at this point? We're simply just looking for those connector words and then highlighting them and then breaking up each connector word. Remember, the connector word indicates the beginning of the phrase or clause. So that's why I broke it up at those connector words. How are we doing? Questions? Cries of anguish and despair.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where's my Kleenex for my nose? Bloody nose.
The towel.
Okay. The towel. Okay. And then the next step is we take this, and now this is the harder one. If I can Now what I want to do is identify, okay, what does the phrase or clause modify and how? Now, remember, we learned earlier, well, here, we'll just do this. Okay, everyone, now this is all I do is each line I just identify what's going on. This is the subject of the independent clause, right?
Indefinite pronoun, everyone.
Everyone. So we're going to just highlight it in blue because that's what we identified earlier. So everyone will thirst is my independent clause. Who drinks of this water? Is this a phrase or a clause?
Close.
Good. Close.
It's a clause. Good.
Close
Because I
answer.
have the subject who and the verb drinks. Now, is this an independent or dependent clause?
Dependent.
Dependent.
It's
Dependent,
dependent
sir.
because
Dependent.
I have
It-
that
Connector
pronoun
word.
who. That's connecting this to,
So,
so it's
dependent.
dependent. And what is it modifying?
Everyone.
Everyone.
It modifies
Everyone.
everyone. Modifies everyone, right? It's describing which everyone or who. All right. Of this water will thirst again. Now, I got a couple of problems here. Is this all one clause or phrase?
No.
It's a good. We are going to.
It's not.
sir.
Remember, this is a separate, we have to
Separate.
separate this because this is the verb
That's the
Of the-
action.
This is the verb of the integrated. I used to make integrated circuits. We call them ICs, so I got caught there. The independent clause. This is the verb of the independent clause. So that's why I highlighted different. Now, of this water, here's where the English language is frustrating. Because actually, the verb is drinks of this water.
That's the
That's the-
idiomatic expression.
Yeah, that's the complete thought, or not the complete thought, but that's the whole phrase. Let me shrink this down a little. Whoa, sorry about that. But we'll do this. Let's do this. This will make it, I think, less confusing. This will make it less confusing. Give me 1 minute here, guys. Okay. Now, as we think about this, what question does this answer? Of this water?
Drinks.
Yes. He's drinking from or drinking this water. It's really functioning like an object of the action.
What kind?
What?
Yeah, so he's drinking what? He's drinking of this
What?
water. So I would
Drinking
do
of
this.
what?
I would put it together as one idea because this is the complete idea. Is he drinks what? He drinks of this water.
Kind of water. A kind.
Okay. So I would word it like I would put this all together as the subject is drinks and of this water is the object, what he drinks. All right? And that's going to modify everyone. It's a specific everyone. Everyone who does this. So it's not everyone, like all the world. It's all those who drink of this water. It's a specific group of people. All right? So it's modifying everyone. Everyone, which everyone? Which
Who
ones?
drinks?
Those who
of this
drink
water?
of this water. Okay? Will thirst again. And remember, this is the verb for the main verb here. Everyone will thirst again. Which everyone? The ones who
Who drinks
drink
of
of
this
this water. But whoever drinks, now what do I do with this?
The contrast
Yeah, it's a contrast.
of everyone and whoever.
Yes. Everyone and whoever. All right, so he's paralleling, he's contrasting everyone who drinks of this water and whoever drinks of this water. But we've got a problem
Different
again.
kinds of water. Different kinds of water.
Yes, they're different kinds of water. Exactly. That's why we have the word but. But we have a problem again here. Notice that I will give him, and then shall never thirst. So
That's
here,
another independent clause. After the word but, that's another independent clause.
yeah, let me put this in here. Yes, we have this. We have a split sentence again. We have this as my subject, and this is the verb that connects back to the subject. Because that I will give him, what's he talking about here? What question does this answer? What is it modifying?
Water.
Yeah,
Water.
which water?
The water that Jesus gave.
Water.
Okay, which water?
Which water? The water that Jesus
Water
gave.
that I will give him. That water. Whoever drinks of the water, which water? The water I give him, that person will never thirst. All right, but the water, which water?
That Jesus gave.
See, the water I will give him. Oh, here we go again. This is not easy, is it? Notice he split the subject and the verb again.
The water will become.
So let's see. Let me do this. Shape, draw. Okay, so we have this goes to here. Oh, I can't. And we have, I like my fancy drawing here. And we have this goes to here. And then we have the same up here, where we have now 3 times the verb is separated from its subject with a phrase or a clause stuck between. You guys see that? So the first sentence is everyone will thirst again, but the who drinks of this water is stuck between it. Then we have whoever drinks of the water shall never thirst, but we have this
That I will give him.
this clause stuck between it. And then again, the water will become. That's another sentence, but that I will give him is stuck between it. You see that? And then will become a well. That's the full sentence there. Subject, water. Will become, verb. Object,
Will become
well.
the state of being.
All right. So this is a pretty complicated sentence because he's got lots of phrases and clauses stuck between subjects, verbs, and objects. So what we'll do is take a look at this passage during the week, and we'll start here next week, and we'll diagram it out, and I'll try to explain what's going on. I know right now you probably your head is full, your nose is full of blood. It's it's bad right now. So I want to give you a break from the English here. But my goal this morning was at least to go over
Pastor
these.
Tim,
these steps in diagramming, all right? So we can just, you can see the process. Yes, sir.
Pastor Tim, if you won't mind, I cannot wait next week.
You want to extend?
Seriously, seriously, I just became curious. When we go back, the in him, the water, which will become in him. So that's a
Prepositional
prepositional
phrase.
phrase that is directly modifying
Yes. Well,
which one? The water, okay,
well,
or will become.
this is a
Okay,
good,
it's
let's
a
think about it.
it's
In
a
him. What
yeah,
question
in
That's
does that
him.
where.
answer?
That's where.
Okay,
Where?
okay.
Where.
Where? Okay.
Will
So
become.
if
Where.
it's the question where, then this will
Adverb.
modify a
Modify will
verb
become.
or a
Yeah.
noun.
A
A
verb.
verb or a noun.
Verb.
Okay, that's
Which
my
one?
point. Okay.
Which one?
So where
Noun,
will
noun.
we fix it?
Verb. Where.
In the
Verb.
where, which is it will become, which is the more closer, immediate
Yes.
word,
So,
or will we uh,
well, we first ask
put it under the noun?
we first ask ourselves, what question does it answer? And I think where, it's a location
Verb.
in him, in that guy. So it's
Okay.
it's where, therefore it's going to modify a verb.
Verb.
Remember I
Verb.
told you, if it's answering the question where, when, how, or why, it modifies an action, or in this case, a state. And yes, as you said, Pastor Bobby, the nearest verb is,
Will become.
Okay.
okay? So,
Uh-huh.
where will it become a well? In him.
In him.
So it's modifying will become, telling us where it will become.
Uh-huh.
All right?
Water.
This is important in interpreting what he's talking about here, by the way. So even though it's just this one little phrase, it's actually a very key phrase within what Jesus has to say here.
Uh-huh.
All right?
Uh-huh.
But that's the process you go through. Again, like, for example, the water that I will give him. So it's answering the question, which water? So it's going to modify water. All right? And here, a well, which well?
Thank you,
Water.
Lord. The
A well
water.
of water. And now it gets a little tricky. Springing up to eternal life. All right, we'll save
It's the
this one
will.
for next week.
It's the will.
Yeah.
Well,
Bringing up.
okay.
Well,
Modifying the well.
it becomes a well. All right,
Bringing
yeah.
up.
So we have to ask, is it telling us what kind of well, or is it telling us
What kind of
Kind of
water?
water.
what kind of water? All right,
It's
so
describing water. It's springing up.
Well,
all right, and to eternal life.
Where?
Where or actually, or when?
When?
But to kind of has the idea of a where, but eternal life is a sort of a time. But either way, that's going to modify the verb, springing up. All right, well, this was actually a very difficult passage. So
Yeah.
we'll come back to it next week and then walk through this again and show you how to diagram it. But I think you'll see in the diagram that there's really three ideas Jesus is presenting here that are connected. Everyone will thirst again, but whoever shall never thirst, whoever drinks of the water, but the water will become a well. So it's three statements, three sequential statements that Jesus is making about this particular water, the water that he gives. Notice he repeats it twice, that I will give him, that I will give him. All right? Now, theologically, the question of what is this water, he doesn't answer explicitly here. He just tells her about a certain kind of water that will give eternal life, that you won't have to drink again. Now he's speaking spiritually, right? She's thinking physically. So the interpretation of what he meant by that water, he actually doesn't explain it fully here, but he does later in John chapter 7. But here he's only interested in telling the woman, look, there's something out there that can satisfy you eternally. And so that piques her interest. Okay.
Have my answer.
Yes, sir.
If you will, never mind. Why Jesus used three, consistently use three state of being verb from the beginning? Everyone will thirst. Then whoever drinks of the water shall never thirst. Then the water will become a will. I observed that he used the state
So
being.
this is an action, right? Thirst is an action. It's not,
Sure.
all right, action. And then the last is state of being, or in this case,
Sorry,
becoming.
sir.
Okay? Whoops. All
Thank
right.
you, sir. Thank you.
We'll talk about
if we
that.
take if we take the whole context, Jesus makes a contrast with the first two statements with supporting phrases, but the third one he points out that there is something more.
Yeah, and
It
I
is
think,
something more than just satisfying thirst. No, there is more to that water pertaining to eternal life.
yes. And I think this third but, could be translated and.
Hmm.
I think that's a better translation of it. And again, we can talk about that.
Pastor Tim, it could be a setup or a case of cause and effect. When you have this cause, then you have that effect.
Yes. Yeah, if you drink of this water, you'll never thirst.
Okay,
Because, and the water I give him.
Yeah,
this water will make you thirsty again.
again. That's why you came back and drink again.
Yeah.
Oh, that's why you drink and drink again.
It blushes.
All right. Well, let's like I said, give these verses a little more thought, and then also read verses. So this, I would encourage you, take some time and so read verses 21 to 24 and try to do the 4 steps that we talked about. All right, just try it.
Yeah.
And if you want to do it, read or do the 4 steps, again, to practice, and then try it on verses 21 to 24. I think if you try to do this on your own, and then when we come back next week and talk about it, you will gain much more than if you just wait till next week to see what I have to say. I think if you wrestle with it on your own and just try it. All right. Again, we're here to learn, so you're not being graded on this or, but I think if you make the attempt yourself and do your best, I think it will really help when we discuss it next week. You go, oh, okay, now it makes sense. Whereas if you don't wrestle yourself, then you won't be as familiar with it, nor will you have certain questions that might pop up as you wrestle on your own with it, and then those questions can get answered.
Be a doer, not hearer only.
Yeah, pretty much. That's the idea. It's just to try it, and then you'll learn much more if you try it on your own first. So I'd encourage you to do that. And again, do these 2 passages. I mean, if you're really doing well and excited, you could do 34 to 38 also. I don't know if we'll get to those, but what I want to do is focus on verses 21 to 24, because we're going to use that passage to do some of the further steps in the process. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Well, that's a lot. I know that's really stretching our brains here today, but hopefully it's getting a little clearer. This is a difficult passage to diagram,
But
but
Pastor Tim,
yes,
we're thankful because it's helping us a lot to be able to see the nitty gritty, which complements our ability to be able to see the bigger picture.
yeah, and
Okay,
this
to
is
see it from the ground, and then see it from the overview. So we can, it's just like Pastor Tim, it's just like being provided the ability to focus, zoom in, and then zoom out. Zoom in, and then zoom out.
on
Worm's
Zoom.
eye view and bird's eye view.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
you
what we
remember
got.
that? Yeah,
That, that's what we got now.
the bird and the worm.
Uh-huh.
Mm.
The bird and the worm. Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
Okay. Uh, let me see. Pastor Noor, if you're still there, would you be able to close us in prayer?